Welcome, brave souls, to a night of mystery and terror. Are you ready to step into the darkness? Hold your breath, because tonight's story will haunt you long after the lights go out.
The Fire Tower, from Obvious One. I've always been a bit of a loner when it comes to hiking. I enjoy the companies of others on the trail, sure, especially my friends, but there's something about being alone out there that's just better. I'm not about to sound humble. I'm an experienced hiker. Been doing it since I was a kid with my dad, who taught me everything about wilderness survival and hiking. I've done multi-day treks through the Appalachians, explored parts of the PCT, and even did a solo trip through Glacier National Park once. But what happened last summer in the Allegheny National Forest still keeps me up at night sometimes. It was a trip I'd been planning for weeks. The Perseid meteor shower was supposed to be exceptional that year, and I wanted an unobstructed view away from any light pollution. There was an abandoned fire tower on a ridge. It seemed perfect too. About 60 feet tall, no longer in service, but still structurally sound according to the forums I'd checked out. Locals used it occasionally, though it was technically off limits. The Forest Service just didn't have the budget or staff to deal with it anymore. I made it to the tower around 4 p.m. after a 6-mile hike from the nearest road. I wanted plenty of time to set up before dark. The tower looked exactly as described. Old but sturdy, with a small cabin at the top and metal stairs spiraling around the outside. I climbed up, testing each step carefully, and found the cabin unlocked. Inside was basic. There was a small desk bolted to the floor and a couple of old chairs. There were also 360-degree windows offering spectacular views of the endless forest. I laid out my sleeping bag and set up my small camp stove, checking my maps one last time before settling in to wait for darkness. That sunset I will never forget. It was gorgeous. As the light faded, I could see maybe 30 miles in each direction. Just trees and hills with no signs of civilization. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. I ate my dehydrated meal, drank some hot tea, and prepared for the show above. By 10 p.m., the stars were out in full force, and I'd already spotted several meteors. The cabin was cold, but my sleeping bag and extra layers kept me comfortable. And then I noticed the first light. My first thought was it was a campfire in the distance. It was a small orange glow maybe 5 miles to the northeast. Not itself unusual, probably other hikers. But then I noticed another light, and another. There wasn't the flickering of campfires, though. They were steady, almost artificial, and they moved in a way that bothered me, a sort of grid pattern. It was like they were looking for something. I pulled out my topographic map and tried to match the lights to known trails or camping areas. Nothing lined up. According to my map, those lights were moving through areas with no trails at all. Some of the most remote parts of the forest. I counted 7 distinct lights now, all moving in that same deliberate pattern, like they were sweeping the forest floor. Around midnight, something strange happened with my equipment. My watch, which had been working perfectly all day, suddenly stopped at 11:58. My phone, which I'd kept off to save battery, wouldn't turn on despite having nearly 80% charge when I last checked. Even my compass started acting weird, the needle spinning erratically instead of pointing north. I told myself it must be some kind of strange magnetic anomaly. Maybe it even had something to do with the meteors. That happens, right? The temperature began to drop too, though. I'm talking mid-August, going from kind of comfortable 60s to what felt like near freezing in the span of an hour. My breath fogged in front of my face. This wasn't normal, even for higher elevations. I put on every layer I had and huddled deeper into my sleeping bag. Then I heard it, a metallic scraping sound from the stairway, like someone or something was climbing up slowly, deliberately. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. My heart nearly gave out. I was at least 6 miles from the nearest road, in a tower few people knew about, save for some random people online, and it was the middle of the night. Who could be climbing up? I switched off my headlamp and sat perfectly still, listening. The scraping continued, getting closer. Through the windows, I could see the lights in the forest had changed direction. They were all moving toward the tower now, converging on my location. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. I considered my options, but they were limited. The only way down was the stairs, where the scraping sounds were coming from. I was trapped. So I did the only thing I could. I waited, holding my knife, my back against the farthest wall from the hatch that led to the stairs. The scraping stopped just below that hatch. And then, nothing. I sat there, barely breathing, and I waited. Sunrise could not come fast enough. Outside, I could see that the lights were forming a perfect circle around the base of the tower, and I could hear what sounded like whispered conversations. But if it was in English, I couldn't tell what they were saying. It was jarring. It almost sounded like voices that humans couldn't even produce. But maybe I was just scared at the time. When the first light of dawn finally broke, the whispers stopped. The scraping never came back. As sunlight filled the cabin, I slowly approached the hatch and peered down. There was nothing there. I gathered my courage and my gear and descended the tower, and I went as quickly as I could. What I saw at the base still haunts me. There was a perfect circle there, maybe 30 feet in diameter, of just dead vegetation. Every plant inside that circle, grass, bushes, even the lower branches of some nearby trees, had withered overnight. It looked more like they'd been dead for months, but I swear that circle wasn't there when I arrived the previous day. I practically ran back to the trailhead. About a mile from my car, I ran into an older man walking his dog. When I mentioned the tower, his expression changed. "You spent the night up there? During the meteor shower?" he asked. I nodded. He shook his head at me. "Don't you know about those 3 hikers that went missing there last year? All during meteor showers, all reported seeing strange lights. The last one was found, but he didn't look right. Think he saw something that he wouldn't forget." I never went back to that tower. I learned my lesson that night. Heck, I can't even look at a shooting star without thinking about it. I found an abandoned research facility in the woods. From Anonymous. I never planned to go off trail that day. I've always been the type to follow the rules and stay on the marked paths, leaving no trace. But I guess that's how these things always start, with a small decision that seems inconsequential at the time. I was in my 3rd year studying wildlife biology at the University of Montana, and spring break seemed like the perfect opportunity to do some solo hiking in the Cabinet Mountains. The area is known for its biodiversity, and I thought I might collect some observations for an upcoming research project. The trouble started around my 2nd day of hiking. I'd set up camp at a designated site and was exploring nearby when I spotted a rare Colombian spotted frog. An uncommon sight that early in spring. When it hopped away, I followed it, notebook in hand, completely forgetting about staying on the trail. Before I knew it, I was a good mile off the marked path in a dense section of forest I didn't recognize from any maps. That's when I found the fence. It was a standard chain link fence, about 8 feet tall with no barbed wire, nothing particularly menacing. But its presence here was strange. I was deep in protected wilderness, maybe 10 miles from the nearest road. There should not have been any structures at all, let alone a fenced compound. I wondered if some old mining claim or maybe a wildlife research station was out here, though I'd never heard of any active projects in this area. The fence formed a perimeter around what looked like a small clearing. Through the links, I could see a cluster of prefabricated buildings, 3 main structures connected by covered walkways. They had that sterile, governmental look. White walls, a few windows, nothing distinctive except for small satellite dishes on the roofs. What struck me as odd was the state of the place. It looked rapidly abandoned. Doors were left open and there were papers scattered about. I'm not proud to admit it, but curiosity got the better of me. The gate wasn't even locked, just held shut with a simple latch. I slipped inside, telling myself I would just take a quick look and leave. Maybe it was an old research station that had not been properly decommissioned. As a biology student, I couldn't resist the potential for discovery. I soon noticed once inside, it was very quiet. You know how forests are usually buzzing with background noise? Well, there was nothing. The air felt heavy too, like right before a thunderstorm. But the sky was clear. The papers on the ground were soaked from rain and mostly illegible, but a few protected under an overhang caught my attention. The letterhead read, Department of Defense. Unfortunately for me, much of it was redacted. From what I could see, it was a research project, but, well, that's not saying much, right? I made my way to the first building. The door swung open easily, revealing what looked like an administration area. There were desks and filing cabinets, a small kitchen, more papers scattered about and drawers left open. It really did have that quickly evacuated look. On a bulletin board, I found a map of the compound and a staff directory. According to this, there had been 12 people stationed here, specialties ranging from neurobiology to behavioral psychology and even genetic engineering. The second building made my skin crawl, though. It was a laboratory, with stainless steel tables, complex equipment I only partially recognized from university labs, and rows of empty animal cages. These didn't seem like your typical standard research cages either. They were reinforced and had odd, unusual electronic components attached to the doors. That's when I heard a noise outside. This soft thud sounded like it was against the building. Then another. I moved to a window and felt my blood turn cold. There was a deer outside, standing perfectly still, staring right at me. That alone isn't unusual, but something about the way it was standing was wrong. It was unnaturally straight, alert in a way that seemed unscared. Then came the truly unsettling part. A group of ravens landed in perfect formation on the fence behind it, spacing themselves out at exactly equal intervals, each one oriented in the same direction, and they all turned to look at me. Why were these animals here? Why didn't they look scared of a person? And why were they watching me like that? I backed away from the window. The third building suddenly seemed less interesting. I was ready to leave, get back to the marked trails and the normal wildlife that behaved like wildlife should. Back outside, it was even more eerie, because none of those animals had moved. They were completely still and still watching me. At this point, I'd rather them just attack or do something. But no, they were like living security cameras. Even as I walked to the gate, they watched me with that unnatural collective focus. I slipped quickly through the gate and began to walk in what I thought was the correct direction. Behind me, I heard movements. the unmistakable sound of animals moving through the woods. I looked back once. I saw them, deer and ravens, nearly in a single file line, following almost closely behind me, watching. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was nearly down. I quickly packed my tent, abandoning my plans for another night. I wanted to be back in civilization before dark. The hike back to the trailhead was the longest 2 hours of my life. I constantly felt watched the entire way. I'd catch glimpses of movement, see more ravens, and more deer that were never chewing anything, never doing anything else, but watching me and standing still. What was truly bizarre was how these two different species seemed to be doing the exact same thing, monitoring me, pursuing me. Only when I reached the main trail did they retreat. Maybe this was a warning. They wanted me out, and so I was out. I was glad to make it out alive, but I don't know what I was afraid of. That ravens and deer were going to storm me, tackle me to the ground, and kill me? Nah, I don't think it's that. If I had to tell you my wildest conspiracy theory about what that was, well, I'll just say my comparison earlier to them being security cameras makes a lot of sense based on how they were acting. I think I stumbled upon a place that I wasn't meant to be, abandoned or not. And if I stayed there too long, I would find out why it was abandoned. Something that I definitely would rather not know. Chapel in the Clearing. From Don't Do That Again. I grew up in a small town in New England. I was dragged to church every Sunday until I left for college. But honestly, religion never quite resonated with me. I would consider myself spiritual, but I preferred finding my own connection to something greater through nature and meditation, and occasional tarot readings. My friends tease me for being woo-woo, but I'm actually quite skeptical about most supernatural claims. I need to experience something firsthand before I can really believe it. Last April, I took a day hike through the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Something I did often. Go out, go for a walk, and have a good time. Great for exercise, by the way. Then come home. I never had a particular trail plan, just me and my backpack, and whichever path looked interesting. But that day, things took a turn for the worse. I didn't pay enough attention to the forecast, or maybe I'd read it wrong. But the weather turned unexpectedly. What had started as a clear spring morning deteriorated into angry dark clouds and distant thunder. I checked my weather app. Cell service was spotty at best. The radar I managed to glimpse showed a significant storm system moving in fast. I needed shelter, and my emergency tent was not going to cut it. To be honest, I'd never used it before, and probably wouldn't be able to put it up myself. I consulted my trail map. One thing I did do was carry paper maps as backup. Sadly, I didn't see anything marked nearby. No stations or shelters or campgrounds. I then felt the first fat raindrops beginning to fall. I quickly stuffed the map back into my pocket and picked up the pace, scanning the woods around me for anything that might offer protection and shelter. I spotted a narrow side trail I hadn't seen before. It wasn't marked on the map from what I saw, but it was clearly maintained, not just a game trail or washout. With thunder now rumbling much closer, I decided to follow it, hoping it might lead to an unmarked shelter or maybe a ranger outpost. After about 10 minutes of a brisk hike, the trail opened up into a small clearing, and I stopped short, surprised. Right in the center of that clearing was this small wooden chapel, about 20 feet long by 15 feet wide, with a modest steeple and a single door at the front. The structure looked old, with weathered gray boards and a roof that had been patched in several places. A few stained glass windows adorned the sides, but they were covered by some grime. I was like, why in the world is there a chapel deep in the woods? And why wouldn't it be on the map? By then, the rain was coming down in sheets and lightning was flashing overhead. My questions could wait. I needed to get in there. I jogged to the chapel and tugged on the iron handle of the wooden door. It opened surprisingly easy. No creaking, no resistance. The inside was simple but smelled of wood. It was made up of wooden pews arranged in rows facing a small altar. Dust swirled in the light, filtering through the stained glass windows. It smelled old and like candle wax, and something else vaguely metallic. I set my backpack down in one of the rear pews and took a moment to catch my breath. Thunder boomed directly overhead, and rain pounded against the roof and windows. I was just so glad to be out of the rain, even if the place was sort of mysterious. After a while, my eyes began to adjust. I started to notice details. The stained glass windows depicted religious scenes, but there was something wrong about them. One window showed what I thought was the Last Supper, but all the figures at the table were facing away from the viewer. Another appeared to show a baptism, but the water was rendered in deep red glass instead of blue. The crucifix above the altar was the weirdest of all. The figure wasn't facing forward as you'd expect, but had its back to the congregation, head turned just enough to show one eye looking over its shoulder. I'm not easily creeped out, but something about these details made me deeply uncomfortable. I told myself it was just unusual artistic interpretation, perhaps from a local sect with its own traditions. New England has no shortage of unique religious history, after all. Moving toward the front of the chapel to examine the altar more closely, I noticed a book lying open on the pulpit. Curious, I approached and found a Bible. But the text was weird too. The letters looked English, but they were backwards, as if viewed in a mirror. The storm outside sounded like it was getting worse. Flashes of lightning illuminated the interior briefly, and I nearly choked. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw words forming in the raindrops sliding down the windows. Actual words, not just random patterns. Am I losing it? I thought. By now I was completely creeped out. Storm or no storm, I decided to just wait out the worst of the downpour, then continue on my way. I gathered my things and headed for the door. Here's where things got really bizarre. When I opened the door, instead of seeing the clearing and the trail I'd arrived by, I was looking at a completely different section of forest. I thought I'd somehow gotten turned around. I closed the door and tried again. And there was the trail that I recognized. I remember thinking, how is that possible? It was then that I heard the singing. It started very faintly, so I thought I was imagining it or mishearing the rain outside, if that's even a thing. But I swear to you now, it sounded like a distant hymn, sung by what sounded like a small congregation. It seemed familiar, and yet not familiar at the same time. It didn't grow louder, but maintained that same distance. Hands shaking, I left through the door. Without looking back, I hurried down the path and didn't stop until I reached the main trail. Once there, I finally allowed myself to take a breath, and then I looked back. The side trail was gone. Where it had been was just unbroken forest, thick with underbrush that would have taken years to grow. I spent the rest of my hike trying to rationalize what happened, and I think the best I could come up with was a gas leak from the ground, making me see things or lose time. But just to be sure, when I got back home, I researched the area extensively, but never found any chapel on any map out there that I could find. I was even embarrassed when I called the Forest Service and asked them about it. I sounded crazy as they told me they had no idea what I was talking about. So what do you think? Am I crazy? Was I a victim of swamp gas? Or was there a haunted chapel out there in the middle of nowhere? We will never go back. From Anonymous. I'm a working man, and I do not scare easily. I'm not saying that to try to impress you, but because of the story I'm about to share. I've worked construction, spent countless weekends hunting in remote areas. I generally consider myself a pretty level-headed guy. My friends Alex and Morgan are the same way. Buds since high school, and we try to go camping at least once a year, usually somewhere off the beaten path, somewhere new. In 2023, our destination would be Blackwater Forest in northern Michigan. It's not as well known as some state parks, which meant fewer people and more genuine wilderness experience. We'd heard about this abandoned logging camp deep in the woods that had operated back in the 70s, if memory serves correctly. I thought it would make for an interesting destination. None of us are really into ghost hunting or any of that nonsense. But I've always had an interest in urban exploration and old industrial sites, and the guys were happy to humor me. We parked off this remote trail on Friday afternoon, walking about 7 miles in before setting up our base camp near a small creek. The logging camp was supposedly another mile or so to the north. We planned to check it out the next day. The evening was typical for our trips, filled with fire, beer, freeze-dried meals, and catching up on each other's lives. By 11 p.m., we were all in our tents, exhausted from the hike. I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded unmistakably like a chainsaw in the distance. I thought it was a dream at first, but then I became more alert, and the sound remained. A steady mechanical growl, followed by distinct cracking and crashing, like branches falling after being cut. I unzipped my tent and found Alex already outside, looking as confused as I felt. "You hear that too?" I whispered. He agreed. "What the heck? It's the middle of the night." Morgan emerged from his tent then. "Illegal logging, maybe? Moonshiners?" That didn't make sense. We were at least 10 miles from any road that could support logging trucks. And what would moonshiners be doing with chainsaws, cutting down trees? We listened as these sounds continued for about 20 minutes. Chainsaws and falling timber, and some noises that sounded like men shouting commands to each other. As suddenly as it all started, it stopped, and the forest went still and silent. In the morning, we decided to investigate the source of the sounds. After breakfast, we packed day bags and hiked toward the abandoned logging camp, which happened to be where the sounds had been coming from. The hike in took a bit longer, as the woods were beginning to get thicker and more dense. Eventually, the trees opened up into a clearing. There we found it, the logging camp. There were these wooden buildings like a bunkhouse, a mess hall, and what appeared to be a storage shed for equipment. Old rusted machinery sat scattered around the area. A couple of decomposing trucks and tool benches and various logging implements. Stuff I couldn't really make out. Everything was exactly as you'd expect from a site abandoned decades back, covered in moss and partially reclaimed by nature. "Place gives me the creeps," Alex said. Morgan replied while looking at one of the rusted chainsaws. "Guys, check this out." I walked over and immediately noticed what had caught his attention. Despite decades of exposure to the elements, the chainsaw's wooden handle was covered in intricate carvings, symbols I'd never seen before, but didn't look like standard manufacturer markings. Reminded me of hieroglyphics or pictographs or whatever. Little tree symbols and animal figures. "What do you make of that?" I shrugged at him. Just a bored logger doing woodwork. Alex had wandered into the bunkhouse and called out to us. Inside there, we found rows of metal-framed beds, most with mattresses long rotted away. We spent another hour exploring the camp, finding nothing else of note. We then headed back to our campsite in the late afternoon. That night around the campfire, we tried to keep things normal, but the conversation kept drifting back to the abandoned camp, and how oddly eerie it seemed. "You think we heard actual chainsaw ghosts last night?" Alex joked. "Nah, probably some natural explanation to it. Or it could be another active logging operation nearby that carries sound weird at night." I didn't offer an opinion to that. I was too busy listening to the forest, which had gone unnaturally quiet. We turned in around 10 p.m., all of us tired from the day's exploration. I slept very rough that night, jolted awake at about 2:17 a.m., according to my watch. The chainsaw sounds had returned. They were louder now, and we could hear the voices of men shouting at each other. I scrambled out of my tent. Both Alex and Morgan were already out there, looking pale. "It's coming from the direction of the camp again," Morgan whispered. The sounds were clearer that night, chainsaws revving up and trees being felled. None of us suggested investigating this time. We stayed huddled near our unlit fire pit, listening as the sounds continued for nearly an hour before abruptly stopping. In the morning, we made a disturbing discovery. Our stuff had been tampered with overnight. All of our tent stakes had been pulled up and placed in a pile. Worse yet, Alex's hunting knife had been removed from his pack and stabbed into the ground. Without even discussing it, we packed up. None of us wanted to spend another second there. As I was taking down my tent, Morgan called us over to the edge of the campsite. "Was this here yesterday?" he asked. Just beyond where we'd been sleeping was that chainsaw we found, with the engravings in the wooden handle. We hiked out of there in record time, barely speaking until we made it to the car. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and could have sworn I saw heavy equipment moving between the trees. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. If you ever find yourself in northern Michigan in the woods, be wary of the sound of chainsaws. Hey there, quick intermission from darkness here. I was running a bit behind due to some crazy headaches I was having, and to get this episode out, I've decided to fill this remaining half of the episode with a set of Bigfoot sightings from an episode I deleted a long time ago. Why I deleted it? I have no idea. So consider this a half-lost episode, and enjoy. And thank you for your understanding and patience. Warning. The following story contains depictions of badly injured animals. Can Bigfoot get chronic wasting disease? From Ghost Mooner. I used to be a game warden for a certain state that I don't want to name here. I've seen a lot of weird stuff in my 8 years there, before I got injured in a gunfight with a drunk poacher. One of the stranger things I've ever seen while I was employed was something I saw walking past my vicinity one early autumn afternoon. Dispatch got a call about a person shooting at some deer right outside of someone's home from the street, and that the person shooting was shooting from inside a blue truck parked on the shoulder of the road, which is very illegal. So I headed over to the location and met up with another game warden. We started investigating the site. The shooting happened right on the shoulder next to a large house with a rather large lawn on the side of it that merged right into a thick woodland area. My coworker and I found a .30-06 brass shell casing in the dirt on the shoulder, and it was still warm, confirming the call. While my partner interviewed the eyewitness who heard the shot and peeked out the window in time to see the blue truck drive off, I searched the area for any possible bullet impacts or even blood drops from a wounded animal. I eventually made my way to the tree line, where I happened to luck out and find a fresh impact spot on a tree. I took stills of it with my phone. Then I noticed there was a bit of blood on the ground off to the side. I followed it into the woods. The land flowed up onto a steep but short ridge covered in trees, and beyond was some type of narrow gully that looks like it floods during heavy rains. I stopped on top of this ridgeline and looked around. Having lost the sparse blood trail, I scanned my surroundings slowly. That was about the time I started hearing something moving through the forest. It was coming from up the gully on my right, but out of sight because of all the trees. I thought it was the wounded deer, and I was about to step forward to get sight of it, but then I began smelling something awful. It was a faint smell of rotting meat, and other smells that I won't mention, because if you've been around dead bodies before, you'll understand that it's not just the decomp of the flesh that stinks, but what they eat or drink that also blends with it. What's worse is that it was getting stronger, and so was the noise. It sounded like something casually passing through thick bushes and dragging their feet across the ground. Whatever it was not trying to be sneaky. I was just about to call out, "Game Warden," to see if it was a person, but then I caught sight of something in the narrow spaces of the tree trunks. A flash of something dark brown, or mottled dark and brown. I don't know. But for some reason, it made me freeze in place. It slowly seemed to meander closer, following the natural openness of the bushy gully. The smell was much stronger now, and I had to breathe more through my mouth, and I could make a little more detail through the trees now. I saw flashes of hair or fur, but it was complex, and the moments I could see it between the trees were too short to absorb or process much detail. Eventually, it was at my 2 o'clock, and the trees were less dense now. As it visually passed in between them, I could make out more and more of what this thing was. It was large, very large. I want to say 8 feet tall and very wide in the shoulders. It was covered from head to toe in dark brown hair, but there was more to its appearance. The face looked like a caveman if he didn't shave, and it had black leathery skin. One eye was missing while the other was very foggy white. The mouth was agape, and it looked like it was missing some of its lower lip. The torso was patchy with large deep gashes with gray muscle tissue inside. But the worst part was that its abdomen was mostly missing, and what intestines remained were dangling off its right hip. Its left thigh had a huge part missing on the outside, and its right foot was just gone. It was stepping on its own ankle stump. I was frozen. I don't think I even breathed for the whole time it sort of lazily meandered past in front of me down the gully. After a while, I could no longer see it, and the smell was fading. So I carefully turned around, and as quietly as I could, I trekked back to my partner, who was extracting the bullet from the tree I found. He could tell I saw something weird because of the look on my face. He just nodded and said, "Had a jump out in the woods?" Which is our local lingo for, "You saw something weird out there, huh?" I nodded back, and I headed to my patrol truck, downing a whole bottle of water I had in a cooler. To this day, I have no clue where it was going, where it came from, how it got that way. I can only truly hope that it's an extremely rare phenomenon, and we all won't have to worry about it on a bigger scale. There is a type of disease out there that affects deer, elk, and even moose called CWD, or chronic wasting disease. It's very nasty, and I've had to put down deer who had it. But whatever this Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or whatever the heck it was, had, that wasn't it. This creature was very dead. Its flesh and soft tissue was gray-toned. To me, it was more like a zombie Bigfoot. Sasquatch on the Plains, from Snellsucker. I live in a very rural area on the American Great Plains. It's a small farming town with not much more than expanses of pretty much every crop you could expect that can survive out here in this semi-arid land. It's nuzzled up close to a large valley with fertile soil and a small creek that runs through it. An interstate highway runs 3 to 4 miles south of town. That's about the only paved road apart from city streets that are maybe 10 or 15 miles from here. It's a peaceful little place, and if you're not working the fields from dawn till dusk, there's not much else to do. I'm a 16-year-old guy, roughly 6'1", close to 160 pounds, and play as our football team's running back. Having freshly gotten my license and wanting to join the fun of going back and forth in the field for 14 hours a day, I asked a local farmer for a job. It was mid-planting season, so he set me to work rock picking and land rolling. For anyone that doesn't know much about farming, rocks can cause problems to the combine and their headers during harvest. So to deal with these rocks, farmers use a machine called a rock picker and land roller. The rock picker is quite a simple contraption. A wedge-like scooper is hydraulically dropped down to pick up a rock, and a large reel, much like on a combine header, sweeps it into a tank on the rock picker. It doesn't manage to get every rock, leaving the little ones behind. A land roller is just a large heavy steel drum that is pulled behind a tractor, used to push those rocks back down into the soil, making it out of the way of the combine header. So the farmer gave me the directions to my first field, so I drove the small rock-picking tractor to the field and got to work. This field was right on the edge of the valley, and there I could look out over the lush grazing lands and the freshly planted fertile soil below me. Although not many trees were present around town or abound most of the countryside, the walls of the valley were full of them. Large poplars and cottonwood trees covered the small ponds and sloughs not far from the edge. The trees stretched all along the valley edge as far as you could see. As I was scooping up some rocks on a dried-up stream bed, I noticed a doe and a small freshly born fawn run off from across the field. I figured the loud noise of the engine was making them scurry off, but I wondered why the fawn had run. Fawns usually hide in the tall grass and lay down silently, hiding from predators. I thought that was strange, but carried on. Rounding the field edge near where I saw them run off, I saw a large bedding location. I figured it might be from a moose, which we occasionally find in the area. That would explain why the deer ran off, but there were no moose to be seen. I circled around again to pick up another rock that I could have sworn wasn't there before. Then, to my surprise, I saw a rock land next to me. It came from the nearby trees. That freaked me out, so I turned the tractor towards the forest, and I turned on the night beams and flashers, even though it was day. The area under the tree canopy was dark, but I put a few thousand lumens directly where the rock came from. To my horror, I saw a crouched figure only 20 to 30 feet away. It was exactly the description you hear on those cheesy shows on TV, or those fake eyewitness accounts about Bigfoot. But this was so real. I could only see it from its mid-chest up. Its face had dark grayish-brown hair, but towards the chest, its hair color changed to a more orange or red-brown. Its face was squished in, eyes a seemingly gentle brown hazelnut color. Its mouth was remarkably human, but more ape-like, nose squished in and head pointed. It was so wide and muscular and just huge. It looked at me with its tender eyes, giving me a sense of caring or softness. In its eyes, I could also see power. It was like he knew just how large he was and that he was the top predator. But he was respectful and had no ill intent. I sat there and watched it until finally it got up and swiftly moved through the brush. I finished that field afterwards with no fear, but extremely curious. I left and didn't tell anyone until now, here on Reddit, a mere 2 days later. Bigfoot in West Virginia, from Electrionia. I had 2 stepdaughters living with me at the time. For years, I've been a night owl, staying up until 4 a.m. I would go out at 1, 2, or 3 in the morning to smoke. Behind my house, I had a patio with a tin roof. One night, I was standing there smoking with my back towards the mountain. These mountains went for miles and miles behind the house up a hill. While standing there, someone or something threw a rock at me. I turned around and said aloud, "What the heck?" I then went inside. Every night or morning at 2:30, my stepdaughter kept telling me she would hear something. I said, "What does it sound like?" She said, "A very loud scream." So these things went on for a while. She ran in one night, saying, "Did you hear it? Did you hear it?" I replied, "No." She had gone on a date that night. It was 2:30 when they pulled in. She said she and her boyfriend heard it. He was a hunter, and he said that he had never heard anything like it before. I went online trying to figure out what we were hearing. I played every animal sound known to man. "No, that's not it," she would answer. So I thought, what the heck, I'll play some Bigfoot sounds. Then when I did, she excitedly said, "Yes, that's it." "Are you sure?" I replied. "Yeah, that's definitely it." On another night, I went out to smoke. It started sounding like it was raining. I looked to my left, and with the light shining from the porch, I saw that it wasn't raining. Then I looked right, still no rain. But yet on the tin roof, something was throwing handfuls of rocks and pebbles. I couldn't see up the mountain, it was too dark, and I was frozen with fear then. But I knew for sure that someone or something was throwing pebbles at us. I called out into the dark, "If you're trying to scare me, it's not working. I'll be out here tomorrow night with my gun and spotlight," I warned. Then I quickly ran into the house. On another night around 3 a.m., my stepdaughter and I were sitting in the dark on the back porch. All of a sudden, we heard 3 loud knocks on a tree. It wasn't a small stick hitting a tree. It sounded like someone had picked up a massive log and slammed it against a tree. We threw our cigarettes down and fell over each other trying to get back inside as quick as we could. We had to move because the mines shut down, but I can guarantee Bigfoot still goes through there around 2:30 every morning. Small Bigfoot disappears. From Daniel W. It was 2 a.m. on a very hot morning. I had gone to bed early that night, and I had to get my dogs out. They were 2 very large males that I have to keep separated. One of them had escaped out of the fence, and I did not look forward to going to get him. Not only had my dogs been barking like crazy that night, but all the dogs in the neighborhood subdivision had been too. This subdivision is surrounded by woods. I went down on the main street that runs through the subdivision. It didn't take long for me to find my dog. By then, I was wondering if the dogs out there were barking at me. All of a sudden, this figure on 2 legs comes towards me. It stood about 4.5 feet tall. Right away, I thought, odd that another kid would be out at 2 a.m. As it began to walk past me, I got a good look at it. I gasped. It most certainly was not a kid. In fact, it looked like a shorter version of a Bigfoot. I started to tremble. I stood there looking at this thing. Luckily, it didn't pay me any mind. It didn't even look at me as it passed me. Then, as I stared right at it, this thing faded out of existence. I was in denial then, wondering if I had hallucinated the whole thing. But the odd thing was I was completely sober. I began to wonder if there was a family of Bigfoot in the area. But even so, how in the world did this one just disappear like some ghost? This was definitely the strangest thing I've ever seen. Bigfoot saved me from a Wendigo. From Frank C. Having the grandkids over was always a fun time for us, as we were now in our early 60s. On one occasion, I overheard a group of them discussing something at the fire pit. As I approached, the oldest of them, Sarah, stood up and said, "No, nothing like that is real. I don't believe it." I now stood at their side, and one of them, Mikey, asked me, "Tata, or Grandpa, are Wendigos real?" "Now, where did you ever hear about that?" I asked. "Kids at school were saying that their older brothers saw them on YouTube and they're real." "Nuh-uh," Sarah exclaimed. "Right, Tata?" Now, there are lots of things we don't know about, guys. Just then, my son John walked up after hearing me. "Maybe it's time you told your story, Dad," he said. He then formed the kids into a smaller circle. Others gathered, and my wife, Marie, stood behind me and put her hands on my shoulders. With wide eyes all around me, I began my story. When I was much younger, your great-grandfather, my Uncle Robert, and I went on a hunting trip to northern Arizona. It was early December, and the first snow had already fallen. We reached our destination by early afternoon, and we set up by 4 p.m. My uncle had a nice trailer he towed with his big four-wheel drive truck. We spent a great evening grilling steaks and laughing at old family stories by the fire. That night, I was awakened by my dad nudging my knee. "Time to get up," he said. I smiled and immediately smelled the coffee. I could never drink it black like them. I had to have some flavored creamer. After a good breakfast, we geared up and headed into the forest. The snow didn't reach the floor for the thick tree canopy, but it was cold. We were hunting large elk. I was carrying my Winchester 30-30 with 6 rounds in my rifle and another 8 in a sleeve on my stock. I also always carried my Colt 45 semi-automatic on my hip. The plan was for my dad to stay in the opening of a canyon. My uncle was to walk on the ridge on one side, and I was to walk on the other side, hoping we'd spot something or even move it towards Dad. I'd walked for an hour or so when I began to smell a wet, dirty dog odor. Thinking it might be a really stinky bear, I unshouldered my rifle. Not sure if I should continue or start to head back, I paused for a moment. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling in the bushes and trees to my left that caused me to jump back. I stumbled, and I began to slide down into the ravine. Luckily, it was mostly loose rocks, and I slid on my backside trying to hang on to my rifle. After I came to a stop, I checked for injuries or any damaged equipment. Everything looked okay. The small camping radios we had brought had no reception down here, so I began walking towards my dad's last position through the canyon. A small creek flowed nearby, and I was able to follow it. Not wanting to be the clown that scared any elk away because I was frightened by a bear, I refrained from shouting out and continued to hike my way out of there, every now and then looking up on the ridge to see that bear, but there was no visual sign of it yet. As the brush grew thicker, I had to almost walk in the water to avoid the branches. I'd walked for nearly 20 minutes when I noticed the forest had gone silent. I then heard my dad calling me from the direction I was coming from. I mean, it sounded like my dad. Then again, it didn't seem exactly right. It was like a good impression of his voice, spoken through an electric fan.
"Frankie, come over here. I need you here, now."
I looked hard into the shadowed woods.
"Come here, now," I said.
It sounded angry now, and no longer like my dad at all. He never spoke to me this way. "What do you want?" I shouted, receiving no response. I thought I could make out movement where the voice was coming from. "Dad?" I called out. Once again, I was hit with that terrible smell. This one was definitely not like the last one. This smelled like rotting flesh, stagnant water, and urine. I then heard this wheezing growl. I raised my rifle, not knowing what to think. I was pretty darn sure whatever this was, it was not my dad. The sound of branches snapping and brush rustling caused me to take a few steps back. What stepped out of that thicket can only be described as a hellish nightmare. This thing stood at least 9 feet tall, with the head of a large elk skull, including antlers, but it had only deep, empty holes for eyes. Its mouth could open way wider than it should have been able to, revealing shark-like teeth and 2 huge yellow fangs on its upper jaw. It was skeletal with patches of rotting flesh and fur. I could partially see right through its ribcage. It had very long arms with long black talon-tipped fingers. It stood on thick, bony elk-looking legs, ending in large, deformed hooves. My God, I thought, Could this really be one of those Wendigo things from the legends? I fired right at it from about 30 feet. The bullet hit its chest area. Bits of bone and chunks of flesh blew off, but it seemed to have no effect on it. I fired another 2 times with the same result. I turned to run, but I could not maneuver over the rocks and ground cover as fast as this creature could. My backpack was suddenly ripped as it took a swipe at me. I ran until it shoved me from behind, sending me sprawling into the bushes. My rifle was at my side, but had proved ineffective. Thinking my family would have heard the shots and are headed my way, I began to yell, "Dad!" The thing 12 feet from me turned its head in the direction of where help should be coming from, then turned back to me. It let out a horrible screech and stepped towards me. I fumbled to get my .45 out of its holster, and I crawled backwards. Out of nowhere, a huge rock hit the monster from behind, almost knocking it to the ground. It turned from me, raising its head as if to get a sniff of what it might be. I now had my pistol in my hand, and I was thinking about running while the thing was distracted. A second large rock came flying from the trees, which the supposed Wendigo easily stepped aside to avoid. It looked back to me, then back to the trees. As it began stepping backwards towards me, there was a loud sound of branches breaking and a loud growl. I then recognized that familiar first odor I'd encountered, but it sure didn't sound like a bear, and I've never seen bears that could throw rocks like that. I then saw flashes of bright reddish-brown fur coming through the trees. With a cry-like roar, something big ran out and right at that creature. I had to have been dreaming now, I thought. It stood over 8 feet tall and truly looked like a Bigfoot. It grabbed the other creature by its bony shoulders, shoving it against a big tree. The supposed Wendigo began swiping its antlers at the Bigfoot. I jumped up and began firing at the Wendigo, sending several rounds right through its skull head. It looked at me for a moment, then shook its head like a dog with water in its ears. I wondered if I even heard it. Suddenly, the Bigfoot tackled the Wendigo like a linebacker, sending both into the brush. I hesitated. Should I run? Should I stay and try to help? I grew scared at the thought that if the Bigfoot lost, I would be dinner. I ran faster than I think I've ever run in my life, jumping over rocks and bushes. Soon I was at the opening to the canyon. Camp should be just over this hill. I ran into camp as Dad and Uncle Robert just got back too. "Was that you shooting out there?" they asked. I told them yes, and I explained what I saw. They both glanced at each other, smirking. I showed them my backpack as proof, which looked as if it had been sliced by razor blades. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Early the next morning, against all logic, I headed back into the canyon. Instead of my .30-30, I carried my 12-gauge shotgun with heavy ammo. I also took a basket and a backpack filled with meat, fruits, bread, and even a few sweets. I approached the area quietly, with my guard up. I soon found signs of a struggle. I opened my pack and took the items out, arranging them in the basket. I placed it on a big flat rock right by the stream. I took my New England Patriots ball cap off my head and placed it on the top of everything. I said aloud, "Thank you," and placed my hands on my chest, opening my arms wide in some attempt of making a grateful gesture. I gathered my things and headed back down. A good 30 yards away from behind me, I began to hear rustling in the trees. I looked, and I saw a 25-foot tree wiggling back and forth, being shaken by a very strong someone. I just had to see. I had to know. So I turned back up the canyon, and I was quickly back at the rock. But no Bigfoot in sight. However, the basket was empty, except for one of those huge yellow fangs that had previously been in that Wendigo skull. I've heard that Sasquatch doesn't really like folks wandering into its territory, but I guess they dislike Wendigos even more. I also thought the first time I'd encountered Bigfoot via its smell, I believe he was trying to warn me about the area. Finishing my story to those kids, I told them, "So yes, I do believe that Wendigos exist, and I also know that Bigfoot exists. And someday, someone out there is going to capture footage of that Bigfoot up there, and he might just be wearing a Patriots hat.
Don't miss out on amazing content. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. Join our community today.